So it's really interesting to first start by thinking about how this all started in Japan. And basically in the 1600s or 1700s, which, according to sources that I've been reading here, is kind of just prior to mainstream banking. They would have a market and they would trade goods like you see here, bring in food, maybe from the ocean or from rice fields and trade. And they basically had what's called a rice exchange. And that was kind of where the location is that they have the current exchange, apparently in Osaka. Or maybe nearby it. But anyway, it gives us an idea about how things started, which is basically from food. So one little detail here you'll read in this green highlight is that from 1983 to about 1990, about 60% of the total value of all the stocks on Earth was in Japan. So that's super interesting. I'm not sure about this fact, obviously, but I've heard other people talk about this. I think it was the real estate in Japan was worth a lot at the time, and you can imagine it's looks better than California there, actually. So just a lot of real estate right on the ocean. You got two sides, and just a lot of very beautiful mountains and pretty good temperature as well. So it's no wonder that maybe Japan and their economy was worth so much, and even still is to this day. A lot of people would like to live on an island. However, there is certain problems, earthquakes and big waves coming in from the ocean because of those earthquakes and things like that. So if you read the Wikipedia page, you'll read that basically the technology at the IT was maybe partially developed by Fujitsu. And you can see they've had a couple bugs and things like this. But it's interesting to know basically who was involved in creating the technology infrastructure for the Japanese exchange. So just a quick review here of the size of this Japanese stock market. So it is essentially the largest in the world, at least according to everyone else, except the New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq, and that means it's about $5 trillion almost, heading towards $6 trillion. And you can kind of see that it's super significant. And the next most significant one is the Shanghai Exchange. And I would say, looking at that geography, you can kind of see that in some ways, Japan is kind of the California of Asia. It's just a huge country and a great environment, interesting kind of geography, lots of beautiful mountains, and of course close to the ocean and things. But there has been some pollution problems with nuclear reactor, problem there in Japan. But again, you can just see basically what's going on here. I want to mainly focus on the kind of the foreign markets here to kind of get some details. And we're going to kind of start with Japan here. Important to not only study the Nikkei, but also look at the currency exchange rate between the dollar and you can kind of see there are some similarities here, but you can remember that in the between early 1990s, essentially, the stock market was extremely high in Japan, and basically has changed ever since that time period. So you can see that the volume doesn't really show up throughout the whole chart here, so we don't really know some of this price volume trend here on the volume profile on the right. But basically, I just wanted to get started with this graph to kind of give us an overview. And essentially, you can see that the economy has really struggled, actually, since about, we'd say, like maybe 2013 or so, and then has kind of reversed. And there's been some questions all along, right? So even in 2000 and about 3, you you could say there was a up side of the economy, and then the world economy kind of took its toll around 2007 and 2008 with the housing market bubble. And then you can kind of see the 2001 crash here as well. So I'm really not sure what to make of this graph, but the pink line here is Japan, and that's the total stocks traded by value, kind of comparing Japan to China and India and the United States. So you can see that Japan, the total value has basically been going up, hasn't been as rocky as certainly as China, and even America is starting to look pretty choppy with a major downtrend in the amount of stocks traded. And yeah, it's just the first time a lot of people look at the S&P 500 volume and they see that it's been going down for 5-10 years. They're like, whoa, so people are actually trading less stocks now. Anyway, but this is kind of the data comparison for India, Japan, China, and America there. So we're going to spend some time talking about the Nikkei. I thought it was interesting just to check out the actual Nikkei's website here, and you realize that it actually started as a newspaper called the Domestic and Foreign Price News. I can't really pronounce it, but essentially that's what it means. And then kind of evolved into what we know as the Nikkei today. And you might be surprised because the Nikkei also owns what's called the Financial Times. I think a lot of people would like to read that. Kind of like Wall Street Journal, but Financial Times, and actually owned by a Japanese company. And some just quick little facts here. You can buy the morning edition of the Nikkei for about $1.50, say, or 160 yen, and then the afternoon one is about 50 cents, and the monthly subscription is about $45 or so. But basically, just give you an idea. So there's a number of different graphs. I don't even know what to trust on these. These go back to like 1914, this first graph, and that's pretty much why I like it. You see that most of the change was kind of between basically early 1950s, 1948, all the way up to about the 1990s, and then things kind of leveled off. So I'm not sure if this is like adjusted for inflation or what, but basically it's the Wikipedia's version of basically the history here. There's another one I want to show you from the 1970s, and you can kind of compare that. So this is kind of that after that major growth. So most of the stock market that we see on like Yahoo Finance and the other tickers that I've been looking at show this portion. And not really the earlier portion. So you can see that when you look at that previous one, it looks a lot more level. This looks like, wow, the economy was great and then just totally tanked. But it's just not the case when you look at the full graph. So I was trying to do a quick little study here to see the PE ratios, and I couldn't really find out the exact numbers. But basically in the last 10 years, it's gone from a PE ratio in Japan for the Nikkei of about 15 up to 20, and then even up to 25 and almost to 30. So it's like, it's basically been about 25 or so for a while, at least the last 5 years for a PE ratio. So that's quite high in general. About the stock market, but basically stocks are kind of printed paper or currency, so in some ways looking at the currency is important. So you can see that from a currency perspective, this is the important line. It's like 100 to 1, right? So you can see in general the average exchange rate has been maybe around 110 to 1, so $1 gets you about 110 yen. But the 100 to 1 ratio is down here, so most of the time it's above that. And it's interesting to look at. I've actually looked at all the currencies, and there's so many different debates about trying to keep a currency a low value, high value, and different kinds of things. But essentially, this is how Japan has done this. So from a historical point of view, you can see that 2008, the currency people started to revalue that and say, hey, Japanese currency is valuable. And then that kind of changed around 2012. And we'll compare this here to the Nikkei. The Nikkei, all their stocks, and comparing that to the currency. And as you might expect, the currency would stay a little bit more stable. So the green line here is a little bit more stable, and you can see that the stocks have kind of regained value since about this point here. So you can I'll just draw a line here. So somewhere around 2012, you can see that the stocks have kind of taken off and kind of done better than the currency, right? And but currency has done better in some periods like 2001. So during really significant crashes like 2001, you can say that currency was doing better. And 2008 crash, kind of the same thing. You saw kind of the currency becoming a little bit better value in terms of things. But anyway, it's kind of a cool graph to see. You can see the kind of the volume profile here. So a lot of trading around this point and this point here. And I would say there is a lot of exchanges here in Asia, and even some that are not listed here. But these are kind of the main ones that people usually talk about. But I'm going to look at the smaller ones for a second here. So you can see that there's a Thailand Exchange, and then also a Singapore Exchange, and a Korea Exchange. And then you have kind of the Indian exchanges, and also the Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and then Shanghai. And then at the top, you have the Tokyo Exchange. But I would say certainly the Philippines and Indonesia should also be included on this, and maybe even Australia should be included when comparing Japan's stock market. But certainly of these, Thailand would be super interesting to kind of follow up on, and even Vietnam to try to see the difference between, say, Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, two very large cities in Vietnam, and so on. There's just so much in Asia to look at, but certainly Tokyo is a big deal to study. So let's just start with, believe it or not, this is actually the Wikipedia page for the Japan Exchange Group. And a couple things I noticed here is it says founded in 2013, which is quite recently. And you can also see it says the headquarters here and kind of how it's organized. But the one thing I would say is kind of mysterious is there's not a whole lot of information here, compared to what you might expect from a typical Wikipedia page about, for example, the third largest stock exchange group in the world. But it's basically made up of the Tokyo Exchange and Osaka Exchange. And personally, I like Osaka a little bit better. It's kind of more interesting area. But there's maybe a lot of reasons to like Tokyo as well. But it seems like basically this is headquartered basically in Tokyo. So some kind of interesting terminology here. So basically, the exchange is divided up into a first section, which is basically all the larger companies, and then a second section, and then a funny section called the Mothers section. Yep, that's right, Mothers section, and those are kind of the growth companies or new companies. You can kind of see the totals here for these emerging companies and so on. And actually, there's quite a number of companies traded on the exchange here, so about 3,000 or so, which is basically quite a number, even relative to the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. Here at the third largest stock exchange in the world, which is the Japanese exchange. And originally, I guess it was in two locations, one here in Osaka and the other here in Tokyo. But I just kind of wanted to get a view so you can see basically what's all going on. So basically you have China here, and then Korea here, and then you have the Philippines here, Taiwan here, and most of the rest of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and Thailand and so on. But you can kind of see that in some ways, I've always kind of thought of Japan as kind of the shield of Asia. Kind of, you can imagine the wind and the waves coming in off the ocean, and Japan kind of protecting Korea, and even to some extent this shelf kind of protecting China. But basically you can just get an idea for these two locations. So we're just going to take some detailed look here. So I think when a lot of people look at Japan or maps of Japan, usually it's like this, kind of centered around Tokyo, for example, and with, kind of vertical going north and south. But actually, the more I've studied Japan, there's a lot of little islands and kind of interesting culture down in the south. This perspective better. It's just so much more interesting way of looking at Japan, not necessarily the north-south perspective, but kind of seeing how Japan is so close to Korea here, and then also fairly close to basically Beijing and also Shanghai over here. And the interesting thing is also very, very close to Russia, right? Because there's this island, this whole island here is basically Russian. And then all this kind of like island chain heading out even into Alaska. So it's just interesting, and you can kind of see the relative size of Tokyo here, and then see kind of Osaka area and this kind of like little inlet. And one thing to remember is, yes, Tokyo is huge and vast and ginormous. Probably a lot of it was farmland up in here at one point. But a lot of the fishing culture and boats and cool areas to live in were probably back along the coast, even further kind of on the south. And if you think about it, the weather's a little bit warmer in the south here and also closer to basically the rest of the mainland. So it's just interesting. There has been some conflict from war, obviously, unfortunately, but basically Osaka is super interesting as well. So it's true that the Tokyo Stock Exchange is here, and this is kind of Osaka, but looking at their website, they still list both of these locations as where they're working with. Zoom in here into Tokyo and see what it looks like. So I'm not an expert about Tokyo, but you can kind of see basically what's going on here. This is a vast city, and changing a lot, right? So I've looked at some of this area as kind of a newer area, but kind of the exchange here is located right over here, and you can kind of see as we funny stories about kids coming in and dressing up and basically doing like cosplay, those cartoon characters you see, and basically taking the trains in from the suburbs just to hang out in downtown Tokyo. So it's kind of sad in some ways because a lot of the new youth have to live quite far from downtown. But anyway, nevertheless, here is Tokyo, and basically we're trying to zoom in. Sorry about this. And if you were to kind of zoom in all the way, this is the Japan Exchange building and what it looks like. Just kind of interesting to see. Exchange Group website, jpx.co.jp, basically coming all the way from Japan. And a couple things here you notice, basically the address. They also show the Osaka Exchange. I'll just click on that so you can see. But basically they have, this is basically what their website looks like. And notice that they have Chinese and Japanese. And it actually just came up here in English, which is interesting. So maybe some just automated detection that I'm English here, but anyway, but basically a basic idea here for what the exchange website looks like. A zoomed in perspective of what's going on here. So you can see that kind of in here, which is kind of far away from this main area, uh, is the exchange, and it might be a little bit tough to. You can see on the top rooftop here, they have kind of a rooftop garden, which might be nice, and because there's not a lot of public space around here. But I'll just kind of pan around here so you can see the full view. And basically, this is kind of the front entrance here. Looks like, at least the where they show the front entrance. But interesting to see just a kind of close up of where we are, kind of in Tokyo. Pretty familiar with New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq and so on. So we're gonna basically primarily look at the foreign, basically all the others that are very significant on Earth in terms of their stocks. So right now we're looking at the Japanese index, Nikkei, and I put it on a log graph just so you can see kind of what's really been going on. So one of the most surprising things, at least to me, was that a lot of, essentially this is down for many years in Japan, and it's basically only changed since about 2012, and even that you could say, but this most recent crash has not been very significant on a log graph relative to what has happened since basically the 1990s, and that was kind of the peak. Right here, you're looking at December of 1989. And I just want to do a quick little look here. So Japan is just super interesting, and if you look at a search here, you'll see that basically that 1989 problem that we saw in that graph basically goes back to overvalued real estate in Japan. And I think that would be really interesting. I was just looking at the Wikipedia page here, and it's got a lot of details on what happened, and maybe it's even worth me going into some details on that. But we want to basically first look at all the stock markets around the world. So the recovery process was a little bit strange in Japan here. You can see these two red arrows. So kind of the first process was just a steady down, kind of slow, and then a sudden drop after 2008 again. And then kind of at that point, that was pretty sudden, and then it kind of, with this yellow line, you can see not as significant in terms of down. But it's interesting to see that that middle point was kind of a fast down. And the other thing is to kind of think about the media and how people find out about the price of stocks, and then also the connection between Singapore and the Tokyo Stock Exchange. You can see that looks like Tokyo Exchange owns about a 5% stake in the Singapore Exchange, which is a big deal. I personally think that a lot of these should be run. It's kind of weird to have a company that runs all the other companies for the exchange. But anyway, but you can basically see that Tokyo is part of Singapore. They could have chosen other parts, for example, Taiwan might have been a little bit more complex because of China or even working with Hong Kong. But basically, they're working with Singapore. So just a little detailed fact to know about. So kind of interestingly here, you can see the stock exchange hours in Tokyo, basically from 9 to about 11:30, and then they get an hour break, which is awesome, and they even get off around 3 o'clock. Just interesting. And then you can kind of see some of the holidays. You can see they have Emperor's Birthday and Labor, Thanksgiving Day, and Greenery Day, and so on, and some other special holidays. Probably some Japanese words in here, but interesting to see when they're operating. 225, all the components, and it's just really nice to have it all here and kind of see what the ticker symbols, the names of the companies, everything. And there's quite a number of companies, and certainly some that you've heard of. And I just noticed like they got Yahoo Japan here, and a bunch of other tickers that would be interesting to take a look at. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the study of everything. Let me know if you got any questions. See you later.